Hello once again, everyone. So, last week went a little bit off schedule and did Sev. Now we're back on with Kingdom Come Deliverance. And unfortunately, Randy has continued to have his cold, so he was not able to come. But fortunately, I found Jake, who was once again willing to be my training partner, all that good stuff. But either way. So now we come to the final bit for the longsword section of Kingdom Come Deliverance. And what we're going to be tackling today is the Master Strikes. Now, the Master Strikes are a bit of an interesting one because gameplay mechanic-wise, what they break down into is a perfect parry. Right? So last time we had the idea of course, clinch, and then we had offensive combinations. Now you have, of course, you can just parry and then launch a riposte at any time. But if you nail the parry perfectly, it will play an animation wherein rather than defend and then you launch an active attack, it will play an animation where Henry counters the motion in one time. Now, let's talk about that term Master Strike. What is a Master Strike, or in German it would be Meisterhau, which I'm a little more familiar with saying, so I'm going to use the German henceforth. A Meisterhau is meant to be, in the KDF system, it's 5 techniques, 5 specific strikes, that 4 of them break an Oberhau. So if he launches an Oberhau at me, I can use any one of the 5 and get him at the exact same time while defending myself. Or alternatively, I can use the Meisterhau 4, but not one of them, but it's a different one, to break a guard he's standing in. So for just the simplest example, right, and one that we'll see again in a moment, if he is going to deliver an Oberhau at me, I can use the Zwerghau to break it. So he starts at Oberhau, I defend myself with my guard, I step out to the side, and strike him in the head in the same time. That's one way of doing it. Alternatively, if he's standing in Vantag, the guard, and I use a Zwerghau, I can of course hit him, or if he goes to defend himself, he's obliged to defend in this way that doesn't allow him to counter at me, and from there I can work on in a variety of different ways. So basically it ensures that he's on the back foot. That's a very quick summary of one of the Meisterhau. So this would immediately cause you to think, because we've been playing that game of German or Italian, does that mean that of course these Master Strikes are German? No, I would disagree, because Fiore at the same time has actions that happen in one tempo that break incoming techniques. So since they're not directly the Meisterhau from the KDF, I can't immediately give the point to German. We'll have to go through the actions and see what they're like. So there's a couple different Master Strikes. There's a total of about 9, and they all depend upon what direction he cuts from, not what direction I'm standing in. It seems like if I'm in certain positions, even if I get the parry timing just right, I'll still just defend as opposed to launching into this perfect animation, but I couldn't confirm that. But mostly it has to do with what attack he's launching at me. So let's go over the first and the simplest one, which is going to be the thrust. So he takes a point forward guard and is ready to launch out his thrust. Now we talked about this thrust last time. When he launches that thrust, it's coming right to center, then he retreats back into his other side, as all the Bohemians have been doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to overbind with my sword. So as he comes in, I'm going to go over like so. Now as I do this, I'm going to release with my left hand and move into the half sword position, and from there just launch a thrust into his gut. Now, it seems like there's a little bit of deflection going on in the animation because his sword kind of disappears out of your view. So it can be presumed that as I'm coming over, I'm kind of flicking it to the side. But here's that once again. Now the thrust, it should be important to note out, is going definitely underneath any potential breastplate or something to be wearing, and kind of upward, which is a very good thrust to launch in following with this. The transition seems not strange. It's actually a good idea considering that most of the opponents you're fighting are wearing armor. This is a technique that we do see in quite a few situations, actually. The idea of going to the half sword to reinforce against something. In most unarmored stuff, you just stay here and launch your thrust low. There's actually one from Codex Wallerstein, which we'll be going over that technique in probably about a month's time, which is directly to thrust at his testicles and quote, "This is a good technique." This is kind of the same idea, but if he's wearing armor, I'm not going to take that chance to possibly skim off his breastplate or anything like that. So going low and staying close to him to defend myself is a pretty good idea. So let's switch sides and show that again. So, he takes his point forward guard, he goes to launch a thrust, boom, and we're in. Overall, pretty straightforward. And he does it against either side because it's important to note that when they are thrusting, the Bohemians that is, even if he thrusts from this side, he still enters, this middle point, this long point, which is what I then exploit. So it always deflects out to that side as you're doing it from your right side. So overall, pretty straightforward. The next cut we'll deal with is going to be the scout cut. So when it comes to going straight down the middle, we actually have technically 3 counters. One of them is kind of a modification, but I'll go more into detail on about that in a second. So when he cuts straight down, doesn't matter what position I'm in, just for sake of, I'll go down to a low position, right? But when he cuts for here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to step out to the side with my right foot. His cut will continue, and then I will take that tempo to strike him. This is just a simple void followed by a hit. So it overall looks like this. The modification being, sometimes you strike the head, sometimes you strike more down onto the arm/torso, which looks a bit more like this. Overall, though, nothing crazy. This is very similar to a play from the Krumpfau, which I would directly step out and cut his arms in the same tempo. This one, a little less same tempo and much more of dodge then cut, but it's really you're complaining about mild things at that point. So overall, I would say a very good technique to use. So let's switch sides and show that one again, and I'll show both variations. So I take this low position, he cuts, just good cut onto his head, hard to complain about that. He cuts. This time, I cut down into the arms, and you see how you could very easily follow it up with a thrust. That wasn't intentional, that was just reflex. But that's the first scout technique we see. So he cuts straight down the middle, you dodge out to the side and you hit. Great time to use it. The second one we see is actually going to be a Zwerkow, just like I just mentioned. However, rather than being on this side, my dominant side, it's actually going to be a Zwerk from my left. Now, what's interesting about this one is that it applies some unique pressures that if you haven't fenced before, you may not be aware of. Which is, if he cuts at me normally, right, and I do a Zwerk from my dominant side, I lock him out in relation to my core, but his core is also still facing me. Now, he's not going to be able to power through because of mechanical advantage that I've got, but if he went to deal with my point or something along those lines, he can resist me quite easily, right? As long as he's got his timing right, it's not the end of the world. Because this Zwerk is going to come from left, he won't be able to do so as much anymore. So when he cuts down, and we're here, he now has to fight against his core, which if he doesn't take a step forward, which again, that's a lot of time to take, is way harder for him to resist, right? So that is a unique mechanical advantage, and while normally I wouldn't use a left Zwerk unless I was fighting a left-handed person, I do use this same idea with an Unterhau, so a cut from below, and it achieves exactly the same thing. So totally makes sense. But either way, all that's happening is he goes up and goes to cut at me from right above. Henry just steps out and defends with his crossguard as he strikes the head in the same tempo. Now it kind of looks like it's happening as a block 2, but that's just because of the perspective you're at. You're watching your cut happen because you're right underneath it, so there's a little bit of delay in the actual hit. You'll notice that sometimes as I step out and do it, it ends up more as a thrust as opposed to a cut. Zwerkow is really good either way. But let's show that from the other side. So, I'm here, he cuts, just like that. Let's show it a little slower. No problem. Out of the Meisterhau, apart from the other dodge one, this one's probably my favorite because it just works perfectly mechanically. But that's the scalp strike. Now let's talk about cuts coming in from this side. So if he cuts from his dominant side, what Henry is going to do, and what the other Bohemians will do, is we're actually going to take more of a 2-tempo action. And this is the one I don't like a whole lot, but what's going to happen is as he cuts, we're going to move over into kind of a Fenestra-like position as we make our cover, defending with the strong of the weapon, and the animation does seem to show the flat is facing you, so I can assume that he's turning like so to present the most amount of point. the cut will then continue, and in that tempo, a thrust will then be launched out at the person. Now, like we talked about last time, most times when we launch a thrust, rather than they're either a very quick jab or they're ending up as kind of a 1, 2, 3. He's not stabbing him multiple times. What he's probably doing is driving it in against the male or what have you. But altogether, the animation is very simple. He cuts, block, hits, and then you just drive. I don't really like this one as a master strike. It's a good cover, I suppose, but overall, out of the main ones, it seems a little bit clunky, especially because his sword goes loose. If it stayed on the blade, I would like it a lot more. That would look a bit more like this. Right? In which case, that basically just turns into a wind. I like that a lot better, but it's okay still. So let's show it from the other side. So again, he cuts in, cover, sword goes by, boom, boom, boom. All that great stuff. Nothing too complex there. Now, what's also odd is that is the only one that comes from, him cutting out of his dominant side, which is a little bit strange, but also I forgot to mention this last time, but most of the combinations start out of your non-dominant side, so it's just an interesting choice on their part. Usually you want to, cut from your dominant side first, but it's 6 1/2 dozen really. All right. Next is going to be coming in high from the left. Nope, coming in high from the right. There we go. When he cuts in from his offside, we're actually going to see a deflection, followed then by a pommel strike. Now, this deflection is an interesting one. As he cuts down, it looks very much like he's meeting it either with the flat, like we talked about in the first episode when we talked about parrying, / meeting with the edge, which, depending upon what he's doing, has very different properties. So, if I meet with the flat, we have that percussion, which I've talked about in a video also starring Jake. He's quite a movie star these days, right? If I use the edge, I actually have a little bit more control over his sword. We'll do that really slowly, right? So I meet it, and then if I turn my edge against him, by pushing my pommel upward, I can force his sword downward very easily and give myself a bigger opening. I believe that's what's happening, so I'm going to go with that. I couldn't confirm one way or the other, though. But either way, as the cut comes in, we're going to meet it, push it down, and then follow through with a pommel to the face. 3 pommels, actually. And in this case, he's definitely pommeling him more than once. But, cut comes in, boom, boom, boom. Right? We'll show that once again. Now, what this is a lot like is a play. It's again similar to the Krumphau, because the Krumphau has a lot of power in this frame. Plane is what I meant to say. Airplane. It's also very similar to Fiore will mention beating down a thrust or other technique like that, which really you just take their maximum extension and just rip it away from them. Closest comparison I could give, not involving swords, is a bit like wrestling, when you pull them out over their toes and then immediately rip down. That sort of feeling. Right? This one works just fine. You can absolutely do a sort of push like that with the short edge. We do see that done. We also see it done with thumb grip. You also will see expulsions with the flat. Not very commonly in longsword, but in other systems you will see the flat used like I just mentioned. As for the follow-up technique, I mean, sword's low, you're close to him. You could probably launch a cut at that distance, but if you're more concerned about what they might do in response, going through with the pommel is the safer closing action. So, let's show it on the other side. He cuts at me. All in all, not too complicated. Now, when it comes to the cuts from below, then we get some slightly more interesting things, which is they tend to turn into sort of a bind, a hard bind on sort of idea. So as we talked about in the parries, people are kind of coming down to this almost flug-like position to defend themselves. Same thing's happening, but rather than stepping back, we're now going to be stepping more forward. So against low from my left, what we're going to see is as he cuts in, Henry will step in and bind very hard here, but rather than doing anything with the point, he will instead go into the half sword and then launch a hard pommel into the gut. Now, against the breastplate, this isn't going to do a whole lot, but against someone in even a Gambison, If you hit him right on the belly button, that actually hurts quite a lot. It's not pleasant. It's sort of like the worst version of the Pillsbury Doughboy you've ever seen. But here's that once again. So he cuts from below, half sword, boom. And all that's really doing is, of course, creating distance, giving him something to think about, etc. So we'll show it from the other side. He cuts, boom, half sword, strike. Just all that great stuff.
Just double checking I'm not missing anything.
Yeah. Now, against low from my other side, from my right, we see a bit of a different one. So rather than going into a half sword position like I would have expected, instead we're going to see a kick delivered. So, he comes in with a cut from below. Again, we bind on hard. But this time, rather than, going for a push kick, like we talked about in the clinch, he seems to be delivering a strike directly to the crotch, which, considering the situation, and given that a Master Strike is meant to either completely crumple his defense or to entirely put him on the back foot, kicking him in the balls is a surefire way to get closer to that objective. So, I will deliver the kick onto his chest, but here's essentially how it breaks down. And then you have a free shot. But without a doubt, people are delivering a lead leg kick right to the jewels. Now there's just one more Meisterhau that I actually meant to go over earlier, which is when he cuts again, high from my right. And this is probably my favorite one because I had it happen to me a couple times in the game, and it always looks super cinematic. Which is, when he cuts high from this side, what I'm going to do is I'm once again going to step out to void, but this time we're going to deliver an unter, a cut from below, into his gut as we do it. So, he starts that cut, and we're going to just deliver that strike up through the body. Now, important thing to note is that a lot of times the animation that played, I watched it a couple times, he seems to always start in his right side when this animation goes, so it can presume to be one that you would do when this happens. But the hands are going to come down, we're going to load that lead foot, and we're going to really spring past them, then we're going to keep going, because they would then turn to face. So, here's that once again from this side, then we'll swap sides. And no problem. Keep going, and we'll switch sides. And all that great stuff. Now, cuts from below like this. Do you see it? Absolutely. Usually you'll want to accompany it with a feint. But if someone is always cutting very high for your head, you can usually get away with this. The trick is to use wide lateral motion, like they're showing in the animation, and to really bait them into going high for your head. But absolutely you could still manage to do this. So, overall, those are all the Master Strikes, the instant counters that you can get. What do we think they are? Do we think they're German? Do we think they're Italian? Well, based upon the actions, I'm kind of surprised to say that for the most part, they break down a bit 50-50, right? Most of these Master Strikes are just exploiting an incoming tempo with either a simple step to the side and a counter cut. The Zwerk is decidedly German. I'd give that as a point to the Germans. The kick does appear both in German and Italian sources, but I'm going to give it to the Germans because it's probably meant to be a kick to the groin as opposed to a push kick. Going into half sword actions, that's again a pretty universal thing. Do I think they're necessarily Master Strikes in the historical sense? I don't think so. I would actually probably classify a lot of these as being moving into close distance, which, if they're reliable techniques, you could still kind of call them Master Strikes, but most of the time they're techniques that actually close distance, and then due to limitations of the game's combat, we can't then stay at that close distance and launch into wrestling and continuing to fight with the half sword and all that stuff. So instead they're just quick, hard hits that take his tempo and hurt him quite badly. So overall, not a bad way to simulate it. So that's pretty much it for the Bohemian fighting system. We have the basic attacks, basic parries, and of course you can follow those with ripostes. We have the basic combinations, and now we have the Master Strikes, which is kind of the ideal way of fencing. I mean, learning the combinations is a great way to break someone's, break their warfare score down, but an important thing to remember is that enemies in the game with a higher warfare skill will use these exact techniques back against you. So if you're trying to use your combination to set them up, and they do a master strike back against you, well, you're out of luck, right? So it's kind of cool that that is always a threat. So you could almost say one of the more ideal ways of doing it, and what leads to a lot of instant kills, is launching these perfect counter techniques. So that's kind of interesting. Though it is always funny when you do the one from below and hit them right on the breastplate, and they just kind of go, oof. But anyway, I digress. So overall, Bohemian fighting. Do I think that it is German or Italian? I'm going to err more on the side of the German tradition, only because its use of terminology, it has more direct strikes or techniques that are closer to the main source. The important thing to remember is that, again, the Italian tradition, Fiore's tradition, he did learn from German masters as well, so it's really more of just the flower of battle. That, of course, would have had overlap as well, and there's even more overlap if you study these systems directly. But just for funsies, since I started it this way, I would probably say the Bohemians are much more similar to the KDF than they are to Fiore's approach to the fight. But, end of the day, as far as movesets I've broken down, this one has been quite a lot of fun because I had to compare it to a lot of real-world techniques step by step, and were you to try and use this moveset in real life, you might get away with some of it. Not all of it, mind you, but you would probably be able to get away with some of it, and that is pretty impressive for, a video game. But either way, thank you very much, Jake, for letting me abuse you, and thank you all for following along with the series. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm probably going to take a little bit of a break, probably just a week off, as I determine what I want to dive into next. But thank you very much for watching. We'll go over some other movesets another time.